Well, Games Workshop seems to have addressed some of the Iron Hands issues. I suspect this is going to divide opinions. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing more news. There's been a surprising amount of news for Space Marines coming out this week, and today we're looking at the new Iron Hands FAQ, where Games Workshop have gone against their usual ideology of only answering questions in these FAQs, but they have introduced some balance changes as well. Now, for those of you who haven't been keeping up with tournament results and generally how well Iron Hands have been doing, it's safe to say that they have been topping a number of tournaments all over the world. One statistic I saw showed that 12 out of 20 tournaments have been won by Iron Hands, and with good placings in basically all of the rest. Now, I've got absolutely nothing wrong with Iron Hands being good, but when it's getting to the point that when people have just picked up the army and they're destroying every single competitive list that has come before it, it does sort of make you start to wonder if the codex is just a little bit too strong. I'm actually quite pleased that Games Workshop have decided to introduce these balance changes to prevent Iron Hands from literally just stomping the entire meta for another 6 months period before they release the FAQ in March. Because I don't think any changes will be made to Iron Hands in chapter approved, because they usually just do points values. If you edited any points values, then you'd simultaneously nerf every single other Space Marine chapter, which I don't think is necessarily needed, as we're not seeing them anywhere near as much. That's besides the point though, because at this point chapter approved has already gone to the printers, so they can't make any changes in it anyway. Now, in this FAQ, Iron Hands have received several nerfs, and I honestly don't mind that, and I'm saying this as someone who's fully intending to go on playing Iron Hands and Iron Hands successors into the future. I don't think that these nerfs combine to break the army in any way, but I think that they disincentivize some of the strongest builds, such as say having 3 Repulsor Executioners, the Ironstone and Iron Father Feirros, a combo that was just sitting at the back, taking way more damage than any reasonable army could output, while absolutely annihilating the enemy in return. Similar things were also happening with Leviathan Dreadnoughts, or Flyer Spam with Storm Ravens and Storm Talons and stuff. And it wasn't only that these were strong builds just hoovering enemies off the board, but also that they're quite a boring army to play against, with a castle of unreasonably shooty units that are unreasonably durable, just moving rounds, just gunning your army off the table for very little in recourse. I believe that these rules changes have taken the edge off that build, while leaving Iron Hands a very competitive army with other tactics, plus their chapter tactic and Iron Hands' unique doctrine, The Flesh is Weak, still combined to make the strongest combination of a doctrine and a chapter tactic out of any chapter. So let's get into this FAQ then. Firstly, they've started with a bit of designer's commentary. They say, while we always strive to incorporate every scrap of feedback into our core rules, while working on Codex Supplement Iron Hands, we received some additional feedback after we'd gone to print. They said they'd wait to see whether or not the feedback actually bore results, and it turns out that they have seen the tournament results, and it is clear that Iron Hands have just got a little bit too strong compared with the curve of the rest of the armies. So they decided to release the balance changes as part of this FAQ, rather than waiting until the next online balance change, which isn't due till March. I am all for this as a good idea. I don't think it's worth leaving something that's clearly the strongest thing as the game any longer than you necessarily have to. They said this isn't something they do lightly, and I understand their point of view. They are going to annoy people by making serious rule changes to a faction shortly after release. That being said, let's get into those rule changes now. The first change is to Rites of Tempering. This changes Iron Father Feirros' 5-up Invul Aura ability to be infantry models only. Before it used to be any model, including vehicles, but now it can only be infantry models. This breaks one of the synergies of the big Iron Hands buff castle, so there's not as much point in putting him in the centre of a bunch of Repulsor Executioners, and you might see a bit more of a mixed force around him, say with a few Intercessors to take advantage of that very nice 5-up Invul. It's still a powerful ability, and he's still an amazing model, being only 110 points. He is still well worth taking after this nerf, because he has multiple powerful buffs. He can still repair vehicles very well. He's got a good fighty profile, and that signal array is a powerful buff to shooting. He's still one of the most point-efficient models in the entire Space Marine range. Next, we have the single biggest one, in my opinion. This is a change to the Ironstone, the relic that until now was, in my opinion, the most powerful in the entire game. It used to provide -1 damage to every vehicle within 3 inches of the bearer or battle long. Now you have to pick one vehicle for it to affect at the start of each battle round, so this means it can be in effect turn 1 when your opponent is shooting at you, and it's still decently powerful. The difference is that instead of powering up, say, 3 Repulsor Executioners or 3 Storm Ravens and a bunch of Storm Talons, it will now only power up 1 vehicle, so it more incentivizes Iron Hands to have a bunch of smaller units and, say, 1 big Repulsor Executioner to take advantage of this buff. You can still do some pretty nasty things with the Leviathan Dreadnought, because you can still stack this with the Dreadnought stratagem to halve damage, so you can still have an essentially almost unkillable Leviathan Dreadnought. It's just not going to be quite as rewarding to take 3 of them, which again is, in my opinion, a fairly boring list, and some armies just don't have much answer for. I think this was a good change. It's still a powerful relic, and well worth 1 CP investment in a vehicle-heavy army, particularly if you have 1 heavy hitter to shield from extra damage. It's just no longer by head and shoulders the best relic in all of 40k. And I think that it's better that you nerf the few really strong things in the game to balance the game, rather than trying to buff everything up to the same level of insane power that the Ironstone had. All in all, good change, and I like it. I will still be playing the Ironstone myself. Next we have a nerf to March of the Ancients, which is the stratagem that makes Dreadnoughts into characters. You can now only make 1 Dreadnought a character with this stratagem. I think that this was sensible, because you could do some very silly things with the character targeting rules. This nerf has actually caused me to delete a YouTube video, because I had a list review coming out with a very silly Dreadnought character targeting rule abuse army, where I essentially had 3 venerable Dreadnoughts, 3 regular Dreadnoughts, paid 6 CP at the start of the battle to make them all characters, parked them behind durable units, and hey presto, you have 18 really powerful anti-tank shots every single turn, and the enemy can do absolutely nothing about them until they have killed, say, 120 guardsmen or 6 impulsors with shield domes. I think that it would have been a very frustrating list for opponent to play against, and I think that it would have rightly not felt very immersive. I mean, it's just a silly image to have, say, 6 huge dreadnoughts standing behind a bunch of guardsmen, and then for you somehow to claim that you can't pick the dreadnoughts out because they're characters somehow, and somehow we're just losing those enormous dreadnoughts in the crowd of guardsmen. I mean, you can still do this with 1 dreadnought, it's just you can't have an entire army hidden behind your gun line. Again, good change, and you can take a war trait with a dreadnought. It still allows some powerful combos. Next up is the stratagem Souls of Iron. This is a 4+ deny a psychic power stratagem from any Iron Hands unit within 24 inches. It's gone up to 2 CP rather than 1 CP. I thought this one was an interesting change, as quite a few armies have access to a similar power, deny a psychic power, on a 4-up within 24 inches of their models. I believe Sisters of Battle have one of these, one of the Abmech Forge Worlds has one of these. Black Templars used to have one. I'm not sure if that's still surviving in the current form, but I'm sure they'll get something similar back when they get their Codex supplement. So I'm a little bit surprised that they chose to put this up to 2 CP rather than changing it in some other way. I think that this is more of a nerf to the Iron Hands army than it is to that individual stratagem, because sometimes it's still going to be worth paying those 2 CP to deny an absolutely key power that your opponent can't afford to not have. I think this is Games Workshop's way of just toning down Iron Hands as a faction by just one other little dial, because that was an incredibly powerful stratagem to have access to. And when I was reading through the Iron Hands Codex, I was like, what? They get that as well as all the other good ones? And it's still a very powerful ability to have access to. You'll just have to use it with a little bit more consideration now, as it has a proper cost with 2 CP. Iron Hands will have to save their automatic denial for a very key power, and I'm sure it will still be used plenty of times. I'll have it in the back of my mind, or my opponents will forget about it, and just when I need it the most, I'll bring those 2 CP out, have a go at denying it, and reroll if I don't. Denying a psychic power could swing an entire game sometimes, so it's well worth to remember. Next, Optimal Repulsion Doctrines has gone up 1 CP. This used to cost 1 CP to +1 to Overwatch, so most Iron Hands units will be hitting on a 4-up on Overwatch. I think the biggest issue with this one is that when combined with a Chapter Master on the board, a lot of big Iron Hands units will be hitting 3/4 of the time with all of their shots, so say charging a Repulsor Executioner was pretty much suicide if the opponent had 1 CP to burn for this stratagem. It removed another way where Iron Hands were basically immune to one sort of army, so say charging a bunch of Bloodletters or a Repulsor Executioner was probably likely to kill more Bloodletters than it would have wounds off the Repulsor Executioner, before the Repulsor Executioner just falls back and annihilates the rest of them the next turn. I think that this was perfectly reasonable to go up to 2 CP. It will still be ridiculously powerful on the right unit at the right time, and you could still use it with said Repulsor Executioner to shred a whole load of infantry charging it, or potentially kill something nasty that was about to charge it and kill it. Again, you just won't be using it every single turn, every time you're charged, and you'll have to save it for something key. This makes it a lot more strategic, but Iron Hands still have that very powerful option available. It's a small nerf, but this stratagem will still see play, I believe. Next, we have a change to Machine Empathy, which makes it not quite as good. Machine Empathy is the stratagem that allows you to use your Tech Marine or Father Feirros' repair ability twice in one turn. They've now changed it so you can't use it twice on the same vehicle, as one of the most frustrating and unbalancing things about playing Iron Hands, particularly on big units such as Storm Ravens or Repulsor Executioners, was that once you'd done a lot of damage to this ridiculously endurable unit, Iron Hands players could then turn around for 1 CP and a psychic power, heal that unit up to around an average of 8 wounds per turn. This is particularly hard because it means that you can't even particularly focus down an Iron Hands vehicle unit, even if you're focusing your entire army to do that. If you even leave it on 1 wound alive, then it'll essentially be almost back up to full health the next turn. This is certainly a big nerf to that stratagem. I'm possibly not sure whether this was needed to go this far. I suspect that you could have just done the same and said maybe heal that vehicle 4 wounds per turn or 2d3 wounds per turn instead of letting Feirros heal it twice for 3 up to a maximum of 6. It's an interesting approach in that Feirros can now still heal those 6 wounds, but they have to be on 2 different vehicles. It's still perfectly possible that he could be doing that each turn, depending on how well your opponent prioritises their targets. All in all, Machine Empathy can still be worth it in some situations. You just need to have 2 vehicles to heal rather than 1. Again, it's gone from an auto take every turn to one to remember in certain situations. And finally, in a very similar vein, we have the change to the Psychic Power Reforge. This essentially doesn't let you target the same vehicle that you just repaired with your Tech Marine earlier in the turn. Again, I'm not entirely sure whether this one was necessary, particularly with the nerf that Machine Empathy just got. It now means that you're never going to be able to heal a vehicle any more than 3 wounds per turn. So Iron Hands aren't going to be anywhere near as powerful at restoring their vehicles to full health. I think this does mean that Reforge is just slightly less viable than it was before. You might still take it on a Librarian if you had another Psychic Power slot spare, but now you might be a bit better off just investing in more Tech Marines as that goes off without having to roll for it. I'm not sure I'm too bothered about this change either way. I don't think it's particularly a good change, I don't think it's a particularly bad change, it's just a change. So that's the last of the balance changes. We then have a few FAQs, which are actually not too bad for the Iron Hands. They confirm that the Ironstone, in combination with the Dreadnought stratagem Duty Eternal to half the damage instant on the Dreadnought, works the way that most people have been playing it. First you half the damage of the attack, then you take off 1. So this does mean, at least for one vehicle, you're certainly going to be pretty hard to kill. The Leviathan is still going to be very hard to take out. A single Redemptor Dreadnought will similarly be very, very tanky. They confirmed that Feirros' Signum Array does work the way that most people were playing it, so say if your Repulsor Executioner was down to 1 wound left and it was on its last damage profile, even as Iron Hands, then its ballistic skill would still become 2 up if Father Feirros used his Signum Array on it. This just confirms that his Signum Array is as strong as most people thought it was, but it's good to clarify so there aren't any debates at the tabletop. And finally, they've just confirmed that an Iron Hands Dreadnought that you've made a character can take a Warlord trait, which is nice and it gives some powerful combos, particularly on a Dreadnought that can't be targeted. So that's a lot to take in. I think that some people are going to be annoyed by this change, particularly people who own the Iron Hands Codex, or some people who bought some select few models based on the rules in that codex. I think that these rules changes do underline that 40k really is a game where you need to be of the understanding that if you buy something that you think is pretty much the most powerful thing in the game, at some point Games Workshop is likely to take it down a peg just so the game as a whole is more enjoyable. It's particularly not a bad idea to wait a couple of weeks for the FAQ from the codex that you're buying the thing from to come out before making the big purchase. Having said that, I think that these changes do not make Iron Hands a weak army by any stretch of the imagination. Father Feirros, if you bought him, is still one of the best characters in all of 40k. He's basically the same cost as a Gravis Captain, but does so much more. I still think even with these rules changes, he's probably worth something on the lines of 140 to 150 points, so getting him for 110 is a complete steal. As a faction, the Iron Hands are going to continue to perform very strongly in tournaments, I guarantee you that, particularly as other players come forward to uncover more of the intricacies of the codex and realise new combos. We will see a bit more of a shift to independently operating Iron Hands units, say things like Stormhawk Interceptors, Whirlwinds, Impulsors, particularly now the kit is out, Hunters, Stalkers, and other things like that, rather than seeing every second list be 3 Repulsor Executioners surrounded by the buff characters. Having said that, 3 Repulsor Executioners, with all the buffs that Iron Hands can give them, is still insanely strong. It's just not quite as much of an auto-win button against 90% of the armies in the game as it was before this FAQ. Like I said, I've been playing Iron Hands armies and Iron Hands successors, and I'm honestly not disappointed with this FAQ. I think it was very reasonable. Games Workshop haven't made anything unviable, and in fact they've increased the viability of a lot of units for Iron Hands that we weren't seeing taken before, and also it means that we're a bit more likely to see other flavours of Space Marine on the tabletop, some more of your Raven Guards and Ultramarines and White Scars, rather than just shoehorning almost every Space Marine player into wanting to play Iron Hands if they wanted to have the best rules in the faction. I'd really like to hear your thoughts and opinions on this. I know I've expressed a lot of my opinions in this video, not just relaying the facts. I would genuinely love to hear your opinions, whether or not you agree with my take on this. My personal opinion is, though, that I like it when Games Workshop does this kind of balance change, as by taking the strongest stuff down a peg means that we see a lot more interesting diversity and other builds on the tabletop in 40k. Maybe Iron Hands players will get a little bit less division when they win a tournament or something, and people won't be able to say quite as easily, oh, it's just because you're playing the strongest faction. Thanks for listening to Auspex Tactics. I think we're going to be covering some scouts tomorrow, so feel free to check back for that. Thanks very much for listening. I'll see you guys in the next video.